In the summer of 2019, a grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem was captured, fitted with a GPS collar, and released back into the wild by a team of biologists from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. The bear, a 6-year-old male, designated in field records as Bear 399's offspring, had been exhibiting what the biologists described in their incident log as food-conditioned behavior. He had approached a campsite in the Shoshone National Forest at close range, in daylight, shown no flight response when humans shouted at him, and consumed a cache of improperly stored food before departing at a leisurely pace that suggested he had done this before and had not yet experienced a consequence that would change the calculation. He was not aggressive toward the humans present. He was not agitated. He was, in the judgment of the field team, something considerably more dangerous than an aggressive bear. He was comfortable. He had learned that human presence and human food were not two separate things but one continuous fact about the landscape, and that the humans themselves were irrelevant to the equation except as a delivery mechanism for calories. The bear was collared, documented, released, and monitored. Within 4 months, he had been involved in 3 additional food-conditioned incidents along the same corridor of the Shoshone. Within 8 months, he had been involved in his first aggressive encounter, a bluff charge at a hiker who had inadvertently moved between him and a backpacker's food bag he had already identified from downwind. The hiker was not injured. The bear was subsequently captured and euthanized by wildlife managers, who made the determination that his behavioral profile had crossed the threshold, beyond which hazing, relocation, and monitoring were no longer adequate management tools. He was 6.5 years old. He was a healthy male in his prime years. His death was not classified as a management failure by the agency that made the decision. It was classified as the endpoint of an irreversible behavioral process that had been set in motion the first time, at some unknown point in his history, when he had accessed human food and received a caloric reward that exceeded anything the wild landscape had produced for him in a comparable time investment. If you have not already subscribed, do it before we go further. What follows is detailed, it is important, and it is the kind of thing that changes how you think about wildlife, wild places, and the invisible line between the two that humans have been quietly erasing for decades without fully understanding what they were doing. The incident involving that unnamed 6-year-old male is not unusual. It is, in the documented history of grizzly bear management in North America, a pattern that has been repeated with a consistency that borders on the mechanical. The specific details vary. The bear's age, sex, the location of the initial food reward, the pace of the behavioral progression, the exact character of the incident that triggers final management action. These details vary. The arc does not. A wild grizzly bear accesses human food. The bear learns, through a mechanism that is among the most powerful in mammalian neurology, that human-associated environments produce caloric rewards that the wild landscape does not reliably match. The bear returns. The bear's avoidance of humans erodes. The bear's behavior escalates along a gradient that wildlife biologists have now mapped with sufficient precision that they can describe its stages, identify its inflection points, and predict, with uncomfortable accuracy, where it ends. It ends in a management kill or a human injury, or both. It does not end anywhere else. That is the central and most consequential thing that decades of grizzly bear research has established about the relationship between human food and bear behavior. The process is not reversible. The animal that has learned to associate human environments with high-calorie rewards has been permanently altered in a way that no amount of subsequent management intervention can undo. Understanding why this is true and why it matters beyond the individual animals involved requires understanding something about how grizzly bears learn and what makes them so extraordinarily susceptible to the specific kind of learning that human food triggers. Grizzly bears are among the most neurologically sophisticated non-primate mammals in North America. Their brain-to-body ratio is high. Their memory capacity, specifically their spatial memory, and their associative learning capacity, is exceptional. These are not incidental features of their biology. They are adaptive responses to the ecological reality in which grizzly bears evolved, a reality defined by extreme seasonal variability in food availability, widely dispersed high-value food sources that require extensive travel and precise spatial recall to exploit, and a phenology of abundance and scarcity that selects ruthlessly for animals capable of maximizing caloric intake during periods of availability and retaining that information for future use. A grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone region during a productive year will consume somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 calories per day during hyperphagia, the late summer and early fall feeding period, in which the bear is preparing physiologically for winter dormancy. The caloric demands of hyperphagia are extraordinary. The bear must find, process, and consume enormous quantities of food across a landscape that does not distribute those calories conveniently. The cognitive machinery that supports this effort, the spatial memory that tracks the locations of productive whitebark pine, stands and huckleberry patches, and spawning cutthroat trout streams across a home range that may cover hundreds of square miles, is the same cognitive machinery that, when directed toward human food sources, makes the food-conditioned bear such a persistent and management-resistant problem. The bear that has found a poorly stored food cache in a campsite has not simply eaten a meal. It has filed that location, that scent signature, that association between human settlement and high-density calories, into a memory system built to retain exactly this kind of information across years and decades. The learning sticks. It sticks with a tenacity that reflects the evolutionary value of remembering where concentrated food sources are in a landscape where survival depends on finding them. This is the first and most foundational thing that wildlife biologists have learned about human food and grizzly bears. It is not that human food is intrinsically more rewarding to the bear than wild food, although the caloric density of processed human food is often substantially higher than comparable volumes of natural food. It is that the act of obtaining human food produces a learning event in a nervous system that is exquisitely designed to learn from exactly this kind of event, and that the learning is nearly impossible to extinguish once it has been consolidated. Behavioral biologists working in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Glacier National Park, Denali, and the British Columbia interior have attempted, across decades and with significant resources, to produce counter-conditioning in food-conditioned bears. The results have been consistent and discouraging. Bears that are hazed, rubber-bulleted, pepper-sprayed, and trapped immediately after food-conditioned incidents show short-term aversion responses that do not translate into lasting behavioral change when the conditions that produced the initial reward are re-encountered. The bear that was aggressively hazed away from a campsite will return to a similar campsite weeks later if the food stimulus is present. The hazing produces temporary suppression of the approach behavior. It does not produce durable extinction of the learned association between human environments and food reward. The learning that human food produces is, in the language of behavioral neuroscience, extremely resistant to extinction. And it is resistant for the same reasons that made it adaptive in the first place. The neurological mechanism that makes this learning so robust has been a subject of active research in both wildlife biology and comparative neuroscience. The mechanism is not unique to bears, but it expresses in bears with a particular intensity because of the interaction between their elevated learning capacity and the specific character of the reward that human food provides. When a grizzly bear consumes a high-calorie food source, particularly one with high concentrations of simple carbohydrates and fats of the kind found in processed human food, the neurological reward response it generates is substantially more intense than the response produced by the bear's natural diet of berries, roots, pine nuts, and occasional meat. The brain systems that process reward and reinforce behavior respond to caloric density. They respond to the kind of caloric density that processed human food reliably delivers in ways that the natural landscape delivers only intermittently, during exceptional years, in specific locations. The bear is not choosing to become food-conditioned in any meaningful sense. Its nervous system is being trained by a reward signal of unusual intensity in ways that its evolutionary history has not prepared it to resist. The bear is, in this sense, doing exactly what a bear with a well-functioning nervous system does when it encounters a high-quality food source. The problem is not with the bear's nervous system. The problem is with the food source, and with the humans who allowed access to it. The progression from initial food reward to what wildlife managers call a full food-conditioned behavioral profile follows a trajectory that has been documented in enough individual bears, across enough separate populations and management contexts, that its stages can be described with reasonable confidence. The initial stage involves access to human food in a context that does not produce a negative consequence. This can be an improperly stored food cache in a backcountry campsite, a residential garbage can left out overnight, a bird feeder in a rural community adjacent to bear habitat, agricultural crops at the edge of bear range, or a carcass disposal site near a settlement. The critical feature of the initial event is not the specific food type or location. It is the absence of a negative consequence. A bear that accesses human food and is immediately and aggressively hazed in a way that produces genuine aversion has had a different learning event than a bear that accesses human food and departs undisturbed or with only minor harassment. The former has learned that this type of food source carries a cost. The latter has learned that it does not. The management literature on bear-human conflict is unambiguous on this point. The single most important variable in predicting whether a first food access event will produce a food-conditioned animal is not the type of food, the age or sex of the bear, or the location. It is whether the event produced a genuine aversion response or not. The second stage involves revisitation. The bear returns to the location or to locations with a similar scent and sensory signature. This is the stage at which the initial learning is being consolidated and generalized. The bear is not simply returning to a known food location. It is actively categorizing the environmental features associated with food reward, building a template that will guide future searching behavior. The scent of human food, which is distinctive and detectable to a grizzly bear at distances that exceed what most people would consider meaningful, is being associated with other sensory signatures. The smell of camp smoke, of sunscreen, of dog food, of vehicle exhaust, of the dozens of human-associated chemical signatures that accompany human settlement at the landscape level. The bear is building a multi-sensory map of what human environments smell and look like, and learning to treat that map as a guide to food availability. At this stage, the bear's behavior may still appear relatively normal to a casual observer. It is not yet approaching humans directly. It is not yet showing aggression. It is moving through its range with an increasing orientation toward human-associated areas, spending more time near roads and settlements and campgrounds than a wild-conditioned bear would, because those areas are now associated, in its learning history, with food reward. The third stage is the one that wildlife managers most dread, and that most clearly illustrates the permanence of the behavioral change that human food produces. The food-conditioned bear begins to show reduced flight distance from humans. Flight distance is the behavioral term for the distance at which an animal responds to an approaching threat by moving away. For wild, conditioned grizzly bears in most of their range, this distance is substantial. A grizzly that detects a human at several hundred meters in open terrain will typically relocate. A grizzly in dense cover may allow closer approach before moving, but the flight response is still present and still functional. It governs the bear's relationship to humans in a way that is the primary behavioral buffer, preventing most close encounters from becoming dangerous ones. The food-conditioned bear's flight distance shrinks. It shrinks because the bear's learning history has repeatedly associated human proximity with food reward rather than threat, and the nervous system responds to this learned association by progressively reducing the intensity of the avoidance response. The bear is not becoming bold in any aggressive sense. It is becoming indifferent to human proximity in the specific way that an animal becomes indifferent to a stimulus that has been consistently associated with reward rather than punishment. The flight distance shrinking is, in behavioral terms, the single clearest signal that the process has progressed beyond the point at which normal management interventions are likely to work. What happens after the flight distance shrinks is a matter of individual variation, management response, and contingency. Some bears remain at this stage for extended periods, moving through human-associated environments with equanimity, taking food where it is available, tolerating close human presence without escalating to aggression. These are the bears that generate the most difficult management conversations because they are not immediately dangerous, and their behavior can be misread by residents and visitors as evidence that the bears have somehow peacefully adapted to human presence. They are photographed at close range. They generate social media content of remarkable intimacy. They are described in news coverage as unusually tame or habituated. The language reflects a genuine and understandable human response to a large, powerful animal that is not threatening anyone. The language also reflects a fundamental misreading of what is happening, because the animal whose flight distance has collapsed is not peacefully adapted. It is at a behavioral stage that, given the right trigger, can escalate rapidly to aggression. The trigger is resource competition. Grizzly bears are not inherently aggressive toward humans under most circumstances. Their aggression is largely contextual, driven by specific triggers that include defense of cubs, defense of a food cache, surprise encounters at close range, and, critically, competition over food. A food-conditioned bear that has learned to associate human environments with food and that has lost its flight distance from humans is a bear that is present in human environments while in a neurological state oriented toward food acquisition. The same animal that tolerates close human approach while it is traveling through an area will respond very differently if it is in the presence of food when that approach occurs. The food-possessive aggression of grizzly bears is intense, physically committed, and extremely dangerous to humans at close range. When a food-conditioned bear, with its collapsed flight distance, is present in a human environment and encounters a human who is between it and a food source, the behavioral conditions for a serious incident are in place. The incident may not occur immediately. It may not occur that day or that week, but the structural conditions for it are present in a way that they are not for a wild, conditioned bear that would have retreated when it first detected the human. Wildlife biologists who have studied grizzly bear behavior over multi-decade careers have described the progression from initial food reward to this stage in terms that emphasize its inevitability more than its frequency. The inevitability framing is important. Not every bear that accesses human food will follow this progression to a dangerous outcome. Many will be intercepted at earlier stages by management action. Many will have limited access to human food in a way that does not produce sufficient learning consolidation to drive the full behavioral shift. Many will be in locations where human density is low enough that the convergence of food-conditioned behavior and human proximity that produces serious incidents does not materialize in the time before natural mortality removes the animal from the population. But in jurisdictions where grizzly bears and human settlements are in sustained close proximity, and where the management infrastructure for preventing initial food access is not fully functional, the bears that receive sufficient food reward to drive the full behavioral progression do not recover. The research is clear on this. The bears do not forget. They do not lose the association. They do not revert to wild-conditioned behavior through any mechanism that wildlife managers have yet been able to reliably produce in the field. The genetic dimension of this problem has been a subject of increasing attention in the research literature over the past 15 years, and it adds a layer of complexity to the food conditioning story that is rarely communicated clearly to the public. Grizzly bears in North America are not genetically uniform. They are members of populations with distinct demographic histories, ranging patterns, and learned behavioral traditions. The behavioral traditions matter because grizzly bears are not simply genetically programmed automatons. They are animals with extended periods of maternal association, during which young bears acquire behavioral repertoires from their mothers through direct observation and experience. A female grizzly bear, with 2 to 3 years of experience foraging in human-associated environments, will have cubs that accompany her on those foraging excursions. Those cubs will learn, directly and experientially, that human environments contain food. They will enter independence with a behavioral starting point that already includes this association, even if they have never personally accessed human food in a context that produced significant learning consolidation on their own. The food conditioning of a mother bear is not contained within that individual. It propagates forward into the next generation through a mechanism that is behavioral rather than genetic, but that is nonetheless heritable in a functionally important sense. This is why wildlife biologists have argued, with increasing urgency and decreasing success in getting the argument heard in public policy forums, that the management of individual food-conditioned bears, while necessary, is not sufficient. Every food-conditioned female that reproduces and raises cubs to independence in a human-adjacent environment has introduced the behavioral legacy of her food conditioning into the learning history of the next cohort of bears. The management kill of the individual, which occurs when her behavior has escalated beyond the threshold of acceptable risk, removes her from the population, but does not remove her influence from the behavioral culture of the bears she has raised. Her cubs, now independent and carrying learned behavioral orientations toward human-associated food sources that they acquired from her, may go on to reproduce themselves and to transmit those orientations further. The process is not efficient or guaranteed. It is subject to mortality, dispersal, and the specific experiences of individual animals. But the directionality of the process, in populations where food-conditioned bears reproduce successfully, is toward a gradual normalization of food-conditioned behavior as a component of the behavioral repertoire of the population. This is not a theoretical projection. It is a documented trend in specific populations where researchers have had the longitudinal data to track it. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where grizzly bears have been studied intensively since the 1960s, the proportion of management conflict incidents attributed to bears with some degree of food conditioning or human-habituated behavior has increased substantially over the same period in which the population has grown and recovered from its near extirpation in the mid-20th century. The increase in conflict incidents is not simply a function of more bears. The incident rate per bear, adjusted for population size, has also increased. The bears involved in conflict incidents in recent decades are more frequently identified as offspring of bears with documented conflict histories. The behavioral legacy of food conditioning is moving through the population in ways that population growth alone does not explain. The Yellowstone situation is the most intensively documented instance of this process, but it is not the only one. Grizzly bears in the British Columbia interior, the Selkirk Mountains of Idaho and northern Washington, the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, and the recovering populations of the northern continental divide have all produced management conflict records that show, when examined carefully, a similar pattern of increasing incident rates driven by bears with food conditioning histories or maternal connections to food-conditioned individuals. The pattern is not uniform across all populations. It is more pronounced in populations where the interface between bear habitat and human settlement is more extensive and where the prevention infrastructure is weaker. But the pattern is present enough and consistent enough across independent research programs in different jurisdictions to constitute genuine evidence that the behavioral effects of food conditioning are not confined to individual bears and are not fully contained by lethal management of problem individuals. The management infrastructure question is the one that wildlife biologists have been most vocal about, most frustrated by, and least effective at translating into policy change at the scale needed to address the structural drivers of the problem. The infrastructure in question is not primarily about rangers and field teams, although adequate staffing for those functions matters. The infrastructure is primarily about the physical and behavioral systems that prevent the initial food access event from occurring. Bear-resistant food storage containers in backcountry campsites. Bear-resistant garbage cans and waste management systems in rural communities adjacent to bear habitat. Electric fencing around apiaries, chicken coops, fruit orchards, and agricultural operations at the edges of occupied bear range. Public education programs robust enough to produce behavioral changes in the human population that reduce the availability of anthropogenic food sources across the landscape. These are not glamorous interventions. They do not generate the conservation narrative of grizzly bear recovery that has driven public support for the species. They generate paperwork, cost money, require ongoing maintenance and enforcement, and produce their benefits in the form of incidents that do not happen, rather than bears that are visibly thriving. The cost-benefit argument for investing in prevention infrastructure is overwhelming in the research literature and chronically ineffective in budget processes and land management planning. The reason is structural. The costs of prevention infrastructure are immediate, specific, and attributable. The benefits are diffuse, delayed, and invisible because they consist of events that did not occur. The bear that never became food conditioned because the campground it traversed had functioning bear boxes is not in anyone's incident record. The bear that was never killed by wildlife managers because it never became food conditioned because the rural community adjacent to its range had a functioning bear-resistant waste management system does not appear in the population viability analysis as a survivor. The prevention infrastructure's success is measured in absences, and absences are extraordinarily difficult to fund in budget processes that respond to documented needs and visible problems. The result is a consistent pattern across grizzly bear management jurisdictions in which prevention infrastructure is chronically underfunded relative to the reactive management capabilities deployed after food conditioning incidents occur. The scale of the prevention gap is substantial. The backcountry camping infrastructure of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem covers millions of acres, managed by multiple federal agencies with different regulatory frameworks, different enforcement priorities, and different capital budgets. The compliance rate with food storage regulations in backcountry areas, even where the regulations are mandatory and enforcement is present, is imperfect. Studies of compliance behavior in Yosemite National Park, which has had mandatory bear canister requirements in some zones since the late 1990s, found compliance rates that varied substantially by season, trail popularity, and visitor origin. Backcountry users who were repeat visitors from the region showed higher compliance than first-time visitors from areas without bear activity. Compliance declined as trip length increased, partly because food storage discipline erodes under the physical and logistical demands of multi-day backcountry travel. The human behavior problem, in other words, is not solved by regulation alone. It requires the combination of regulation, infrastructure that makes compliance easy, enforcement that makes non-compliance costly, and a level of public education that produces internalized behavioral norms rather than external regulatory compliance. The rural community dimension of the prevention problem is in many ways more complex than the backcountry dimension, because the population involved is not a regulated visitor population moving through a managed area, but a permanent resident population living within or adjacent to occupied bear habitat. The conflict between grizzly bears and rural communities in the northern Rocky Mountain region is not primarily about campers with improperly stored food. It is primarily about the accumulated food attractants of normal rural life, the livestock operations, the apiaries, the fruit trees, the compost piles, the garbage service that comes weekly rather than daily, the chicken coops and rabbit hutches, and dog food bowls that are part of the normal landscape of rural existence in the American West, and that represent, to a grizzly bear navigating the same landscape, a distributed array of potential caloric rewards that the wild landscape does not match in density or reliability. The communities most affected by grizzly bear conflict in the northern Rockies are not wealthy resort communities with recreational land uses. They are working ranching and farming communities with long histories in the land, complicated relationships with federal land management agencies, and a legitimate grievance about being asked to bear the specific costs of a recovery program whose benefits are distributed broadly across a public that does not live in proximity to the animals being recovered. The predator loss payments available through federal and state programs have historically been inadequate to compensate for actual losses, slow to process, and conditioned on standards of documentation that are difficult to meet in the normal course of ranching in remote terrain. The non-lethal conflict reduction tools, the electric fencing, the guardian animals, the livestock management practices recommended by wildlife agencies impose real costs on operations that are frequently operating on thin margins in a challenging agricultural economy. The ask being made of rural communities adjacent to grizzly habitat is genuine and large, and the support being provided to meet that ask has been genuine but insufficient. This matters to the human food and bear behavior story because the communities that are most resistant to bear-human conflict reduction measures are frequently the same communities where the food conditioning problem is most acute. The rancher who lost 3 sheep to a grizzly last spring and has not received compensation for 2 of them because he could not provide the documentation required by the program is not, in a human behavioral sense, a well-placed candidate for enthusiastic compliance with electric fencing requirements for his remaining livestock. The rural homeowner who has been having garbage cans raided for 2 seasons and has not been contacted by wildlife managers about bear-resistant options is not in a behavioral frame that produces voluntary adoption of expensive new infrastructure. The relationship between wildlife agencies and the communities that live with grizzly bears is not simply a matter of education and compliance. It is a matter of trust, reciprocity, and the felt sense of whether the management system is working for the community or imposing on it. In many of the communities with the most serious conflict records, the trust deficit is substantial, and the felt sense is one of imposition rather than partnership. The research on conflict reduction has identified community-based approaches, where wildlife agency staff are present in communities year-round, rather than in crisis response mode, where conflict reduction tools are provided at no cost or subsidized cost rather than recommended as a voluntary purchase, and where compensation programs function quickly and fairly, rather than slowly and conditionally, as significantly more effective than the standard regulatory and enforcement model. The Wyoming Livestock Board's Grizzly Bear Conflict Reduction Program, which combines proactive outreach with subsidized non-lethal deterrent provision and a compensation mechanism with streamlined documentation requirements, has produced measurable reductions in conflict incidents in specific areas where it has been fully implemented. The results are not transformative. The prevention problem at the landscape scale is not solved by any existing program, but the differential between communities with active partnership approaches and communities with only regulatory frameworks is large enough to be meaningful, and it points toward the kind of structural shift in how wildlife agencies operate in bear country that most agencies have not yet made. The research community studying grizzly bear food conditioning has produced a body of work over the past 4 decades that represents one of the most detailed examinations of human-wildlife conflict in North American conservation history. The researchers involved have tracked individual bears through their full behavioral progressions. They have analyzed the incident records of hundreds of management interventions. They have produced population-level analyses of conflict rates relative to demographic variables. They have conducted experimental and quasi-experimental studies of prevention interventions. What they have learned is detailed, consistent across independent research programs, and sobering in its implications. The core finding, stated in its simplest form, is this: human food changes a grizzly bear in ways that cannot be undone. The mechanism is neurological. The learning is consolidated rapidly, generalizes broadly, and resists extinction through any practically deployable management intervention. The behavioral consequences follow a predictable progression whose endpoint is either a management kill, a human injury, or, in the best cases, an animal whose quality of life and reproductive success have been substantially degraded by the conflict management measures required to keep it in the landscape at all. The prevention of the initial food access event is the only intervention that reliably prevents this outcome. Everything downstream of that initial event is management of a problem that has already been created, not prevention of a problem that might occur. The bears themselves deserve a place in this account that is not only about their danger to humans or their status as a management problem. The grizzly bear is among the most ecologically significant mammals in North America, not as a symbolic species or a charismatic megafauna representative of wilderness, but as a functional ecological agent with measurable effects on the landscapes it inhabits. The bear's role in seed dispersal, specifically its role in spreading huckleberry, serviceberry, and other berry-producing shrubs across disturbed terrain through the deposition of seed-containing scat, contributes meaningfully to the recovery and diversity of plant communities in areas of high bear density. Its role in redistributing marine nutrients, from salmon carcasses into riparian and upland habitats, in the coastal and interior populations where salmon remain accessible, is ecologically significant at spatial scales that extend well beyond the riparian corridor where the fish were caught. Its role as a soil disturber through excavation for ground squirrels, yampa roots, and other subterranean food sources produces habitat structure that benefits plant communities and other small mammals. These are not incidental effects. They are the ecological functions of a large omnivore operating at the scale of a landscape process, and they have been reduced or eliminated across enormous areas of the bear's former range by the extirpation and near-extirpation that defined the species' 20th century history in the contiguous United States. The recovery of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the northern continental divide over the past 4 decades is one of the genuine success stories of the Endangered Species Act, and it is a success story that was produced by a combination of legal protection, habitat conservation, and the dedicated work of wildlife managers, researchers, and advocates across multiple states and federal agencies. The population in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which stood at an estimated 136 animals in 1975 when the species was listed, had grown to an estimated 700 or more animals by the mid-2010s. The Northern Continental Divide population is estimated at over 1,000 animals. The Selkirks, the Cabinet Yaak, and the North Cascades, where the species is functionally absent or present at extremely low numbers, represent the remaining gaps in the recovery picture for the contiguous United States. The recovery trajectory in the populations where it has occurred is biologically remarkable and represents the outcome of management investments that deserve recognition. The complication introduced by the food conditioning problem is that recovery success has produced the conditions under which food conditioning becomes more prevalent, not less. A larger bear population means more bears moving through the human-adjacent terrain at the edges of occupied habitat. More bears moving through human-adjacent terrain means more opportunities for initial food access events. More initial food access events means more food-conditioned individuals. More food-conditioned individuals means more management conflicts, more management kills, and, given the maternal transmission mechanism, a progressive increase in the proportion of the population with food conditioning experience or food conditioning behavioral inheritance in their history. The recovery success and the food conditioning problem are not in simple opposition. They are coupled dynamics in which the former, without adequate prevention infrastructure, generates the latter at a rate that could, over time, undermine the quality and sustainability of the recovery it celebrates. This is the part of the grizzly bear success story that is not in the press releases. The relationship between hyperphagia, the fall pre-denning feeding period, and food conditioning risk is a seasonally specific aspect of the problem that has important practical management implications. During hyperphagia, a grizzly bear's drive to consume calories is at its annual maximum. The neurological state associated with hyperphagia is one of intense foraging motivation and elevated exploration of novel food sources. A bear in hyperphagia that encounters a human food source is a bear that is neurologically primed to exploit it, in a way that the same bear in spring, emerging from the den in a state of lower motivation, might not. The learning event produced by a high-calorie food reward during hyperphagia is likely to be consolidated more intensely than the same event at other times of year, simply because the reward is encountered in a neurological context of maximal motivational relevance. The bears that wildlife managers most frequently describe as having undergone a rapid and complete behavioral shift following an initial food conditioning event are disproportionately bears for whom that event occurred during late summer or fall. The practical implication is that the prevention infrastructure most urgently needed in bear country is not uniformly distributed across the calendar. The backcountry camping season peaks in summer and early fall in most of the major grizzly bear management areas of the Northern Rockies. The overlap between peak human use and hyperphagia is substantial. The weeks from mid-August through mid-October, when backcountry use is still significant and bears are in their most intensive foraging period, represent the highest risk window for initial food access events in backcountry settings. This is a predictable pattern. It does not require extraordinary resources to respond to it. It requires the specific application of existing resources to the specific window of highest risk, and the management literature suggests that enforcement and education efforts concentrated in this period produce returns substantially above what would be expected from uniform year-round investment. The suburban and peri-urban dimension of the food conditioning problem deserves extended attention because it is the dimension whose importance has been growing fastest in the contemporary management context and whose complexity is least captured by the backcountry-focused framing that has historically dominated the grizzly bear conflict literature. The traditional mental model of the food-conditioned grizzly places the problem primarily in the backcountry and at the edges of agricultural operations. The contemporary reality, in communities along the Rocky Mountain front, in the valleys of the Flathead and the Stillwater and the North Fork of the Flathead, in the resort communities adjacent to Yellowstone and Glacier, is that the food conditioning problem is increasingly a suburban problem. It is a problem of residential neighborhoods where bird feeders and garbage cans and unsecured chicken coops and pet food left on back porches represent a distributed grid of food attractants that a large-brained, spatially sophisticated omnivore navigates with remarkable efficiency. The suburban bear, as wildlife managers have informally designated the category, is not a different animal from the backcountry bear in any meaningful biological sense. It is the same animal, with the same nervous system and the same learning capacities, operating in an environment that is denser in food attractants, higher in human density, and more constrained in the management options available when conflict occurs. The suburban grizzly that has learned to raid garbage cans along a residential road corridor is learning in an environment that provides reinforcement more reliably and densely than the backcountry campground, because residential garbage generation is daily rather than seasonal, and the residents providing it are year-round rather than transient visitors. The learning consolidation that this environment produces is, if anything, faster and more durable than that produced by a single backcountry incident. The management options available are also more constrained. Lethal removal of a bear that is raiding garbage cans in a residential neighborhood generates a very different public response than removal of a bear that has been involved in a wilderness encounter. The residential communities that border grizzly habitat in the northern Rocky Mountain region, as throughout the species range, are communities where people have chosen to live in proximity to wild landscapes and wild animals, and who frequently hold strong views about the conservation of both. The management action that is straightforwardly justifiable from a conflict reduction standpoint in an agricultural or backcountry context becomes politically and socially complicated in a residential context where the individual bear involved has been photographed, named informally by residents, and invested with a kind of neighborhood identity that makes its removal feel like a loss rather than a management decision. The willingness of wildlife agencies to navigate this complexity honestly, to communicate clearly that the suburban bear, whose photographs are generating wonder and engagement, is an animal undergoing a behavioral process that ends predictably, is the communication challenge that the management literature has been most candid about finding difficult. The agencies are navigating a genuine tension. They serve a public that loves grizzly bears and wants them to exist and thrive in wild landscapes. They also serve a public that wants to be safe in its neighborhoods and that has a legitimate interest in wildlife management decisions that protect both people and animals from the consequences of the food conditioning progression. The communication strategy that emphasizes wonder and rarity while downplaying the trajectory of the specific animals generating the wonder serves one part of this public at the cost of being honest with all of it. The research on what happens to food-conditioned bears that are not lethally removed has produced a picture that is more complex and more specific than the simple endpoint of management kill. Some food-conditioned bears are relocated, moved from areas of conflict to areas with lower human density, in the hope that the behavioral association will weaken in an environment where food rewards from human sources are unavailable. The relocation approach has a long history in grizzly bear management, and a long history of disappointing results that the management community has been slow to fully internalize. The relocation failure rate, defined as the percentage of relocated food-conditioned bears that are involved in a subsequent conflict incident within a defined time period, is high and has been documented across multiple studies in multiple management contexts. Bears relocated substantial distances from their home range, beyond the distances at which they might realistically navigate back, still show conflict behaviors in their new locations at rates that reflect the persistence of their food conditioning. They are not starting fresh in a new environment. They are bringing a learned behavioral orientation toward human-associated environments with them, and that orientation guides their behavior in the new location just as it did in the original one. The aversive conditioning approach, in which food-conditioned bears are subjected to aggressive negative reinforcement experiences intended to extinguish the learned approach behavior, has been studied more rigorously in recent years, with results that are somewhat more encouraging than the relocation data, but still substantially below what would be required to make it a reliable management tool. Bears subjected to intensive aversive conditioning protocols in controlled research settings show measurable increases in wariness of human approach and measurable decreases in food site revisitation for periods ranging from weeks to months. The durability of the effect beyond a few months in animals that have had multiple food conditioning events in their history is not well established. The practical constraints on deploying aversive conditioning in field management contexts, where the intensity and timing of conditioning events cannot be controlled with anything approaching the precision of a research protocol, make it difficult to translate the research findings into reliable field management outcomes. The consensus position of the wildlife biologists most familiar with the evidence is that aversive conditioning is a useful supplementary tool in specific limited contexts, primarily in animals with brief food conditioning histories encountered early in the behavioral progression, and not a substitute for prevention at the front end of the process. The long-term population-level consequences of chronic food conditioning in grizzly bear populations have been analyzed in population viability models that integrate behavioral and demographic data in ways that are technically complex, but whose implications are not. A population in which a significant fraction of individuals have food conditioning histories, in which conflict-related mortality is elevated relative to natural background mortality, and in which the behavioral legacy of food conditioning is being transmitted maternally to successive cohorts of young bears, is a population under a form of selective pressure that is not random with respect to behavioral type. The bears that are being removed by management conflict are not a random sample of the population. They are, disproportionately, the bears that are most behaviorally flexible, most exploratory, most willing to engage with novel environments, and most capable of learning from unusual food rewards. These are not the worst qualities a grizzly bear can have from an evolutionary standpoint. In historical environments without human food attractants, behavioral flexibility and environmental exploration were almost certainly adaptive. In contemporary environments, where those traits express as food conditioning and conflict, they are the traits being selected against by management removal. The population is being shaped, generation by generation, by a selection pressure that no one designed and that is not necessarily moving in the direction that would produce the most ecologically functional and behaviorally wild bears for the long-term future of the species. The implications of this for conservation strategy have been articulated most clearly by researchers working at the intersection of population genetics, behavioral ecology, and wildlife management, and they are implications that the broader conservation community has not yet fully absorbed. The grizzly bear recovery program, as it has been implemented, has been enormously successful at increasing numbers and expanding range. It has been less attentive to the behavioral quality of the population being recovered, specifically to the question of whether the management practices accompanying recovery are selecting for behavioral profiles that will produce more or fewer conflict incidents, more or fewer food-conditioned individuals, more or less wild-conditioned foraging behavior as the recovered population grows into the expanded range